Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling, a pretty big topic.
Bigger than usual.
You could say that. We're going to explore the reign of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, talk about a double whammy of responsibility.
An empire on two shoulders.
Exactly. And to guide us through this historical labyrinth, we're going to use excerpts from an Italian YouTube lecture, Carlo Vidasborgo, Un Impero Mondiale, by Giuseppe A. Peri. So let's dive right in and see what we can unearth about Charles V's ambitions, his challenges, and, well, just what it took to lead an empire that spanned, continents.
Yeah, you might think ruling an empire is all about power and glory, but imagine the weight of the world on your shoulders. Charles V inherited a Europe teetering on the edge of chaos.
From the get-go, it sounds like a trial by fire.
Oh, absolutely. He becomes emperor in 1519, right? And he steps right into this tangle of alliances. The Pope, England, Venice, all lined up to counter French aggression in Italy. That was the spark that set off the first of many Franco-Habsburg wars. But here's where it gets interesting. After becoming emperor, Charles V spent 7 years in Spain.
7 years. Wow. I mean, wouldn't you think he'd want to be, closer to the heart of his empire? Why Spain?
It's a great question, and the lecture actually points to this period as super significant for Charles V.
Yeah.
Not only did this long stay likely shape how Europeans viewed him, possibly seeing him as more Spanish, right?
Right.
But it also immersed him in Spanish culture and politics, maybe even gave him a different way of thinking about things. Imagine being totally immersed in a new culture for that long. It's bound to leave a mark.
It makes you wonder how those experiences influenced his later decisions. So he's dealing with these power struggles in Europe, but weren't there also threats from outside the continent?
For sure. The lecture really highlights two major threats looming over everything. First, you have Turkish expansion in the Mediterranean. The fall of Rhodes, for example, that was a massive blow to Christian forces. And then, of course, you have the constant power struggles between the European monarchies themselves. It's like the map of Europe was constantly being redrawn as these forces collided.
It sounds like Charles V was walking a tightrope, trying to keep everything from, completely falling apart. Wars are expensive, though, right? Lives and resources, the whole shebang. How did rulers like Charles V even finance these massive conflicts?
It's fascinating to consider how warfare actually pushed changes in how states worked. Back then, rulers relied heavily on voluntary taxes and loans, often from these powerful international financiers. It wasn't just raising an army, it was about building a whole financial system to support it. The lecture suggests that the drawn-out nature of these wars they drag on for years actually helped shape the development of what we now recognize as modern states.
So warfare wasn't just about winning battles. It was about reshaping societies from the ground up. That's a pretty profound idea. And it wasn't just one type of army marching across Europe, right? Who were these soldiers fighting for Charles V?
Picture a battlefield way more diverse than we might imagine. It wasn't all knights in shining armor. You had your professional soldiers, highly trained infantry from Spain and Germany, local militias raised from towns and villages, and even mercenary companies, soldiers for hire, basically, fighting for the highest bidder. A true mix of military traditions and tactics all thrown together.
It's mind-boggling to think about the complexity of it all. So we have this young emperor facing wars on multiple fronts, an empire constantly under threat. But there was something else brewing during Charles V's reign, something that would shake the very foundations of Europe, the Reformation.
Right on. Martin Luther's ideas were spreading like wildfire through Germany, directly challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. And Charles V found himself in the unenviable position of trying to enforce the Edict of Worms. This edict labeled Luther and his teachings heretical, which was like trying to stop a tidal wave.
Almost impossible to contain. And the Pope at the time, Adrian VI, he wasn't making things any easier, was he?
Not really. Adrian VI was deeply concerned about Lutheranism spreading, that's for sure. But he was also a reformer at heart. He was calling for change within the Catholic Church, but was hitting a wall of resistance from the German states.
So Charles V's in this incredibly difficult position, a rebellious population embracing these new religious ideas, and then a pope demanding reforms that alienate some of his most powerful subjects. What a dilemma. And then to top it all off, he had to deal with his own brother, Ferdinand, governing Germany in his absence. How'd that dynamic play out?
Not smoothly, let's just say that. Ferdinand, though capable, wasn't familiar with the German language and had to rely heavily on Spanish advisors. Naturally, this created friction and resentment among the German nobility. You can imagine the rumors and distrust swirling around.
Oh, I bet. Talk about a recipe for disaster. So Charles is battling external enemies, trying to navigate this religious turmoil, and struggling to maintain family unity. Was there anything else adding to this already overwhelming situation?
Both Charles and Ferdinand shared this burning ambition for expansion. It suggested that they inherited this from their grandfather, Maximilian I, who had dreamt of this vast Habsburg Empire. That ambition, fueled by, well, a mix of personal desire, political strategy, and maybe even a sense of destiny, would have a huge impact on Charles V's reign and really on the course of European history.
Expansion seems to be a theme here. It makes you think, was Charles V ever content, or was he always striving for more? But let's shift gears a bit. The lecture mentioned the change in Charles V's style while in Spain. It sounds like he went through some kind of transformation during that time.
It's interesting how different environments can shape a person, even an emperor. The lecture highlights that Charles V adopted this more majestic style in Spain. He even started using the grand title, Sacra Caesarea Maius. It's like he was consciously crafting a new image, projecting this aura of authority and power that matched his imperial status.
A royal makeover, so to speak.
Exactly. And it went beyond just his personal style. His advisors, particularly the Dutchman Henry of Nassau and the Italian Riccarino Gattinara, played a big role in shaping his court. It became this fascinating blend of Burgundian, imperial, and Spanish elements. The lecture even mentions the presence of Baldassare Castiglione, the author of the Book of the Courtier, at Charles V's court.
Castiglione, the etiquette guru of the Renaissance, what was he doing there?
His presence really speaks to the cultural exchange happening at Charles V's court. Castiglione's book, the Book of the Courtier, was basically a guide to courtly behavior, laying out the ideal qualities of a Renaissance gentleman. Imagine the conversations and debates in those elegant halls, with courtiers from such different backgrounds coming together.
A true melting pot of cultures. And speaking of culture, Charles V wasn't just a warrior and a diplomat. He was also a patron of the arts, right?
Totally. He commissioned the construction of this beautiful Renaissance palace in Granada, which shows his appreciation for art and architecture. It's a good reminder that even in times of war and upheaval, beauty and creativity can still flourish.
So he's building palaces, cultivating the sophisticated court, and projecting an image of imperial grandeur. But what about the Spanish nobility? You know, those proud grandees with their own ambitions and agendas. How did Charles V handle them?
It seems like he walked a fine line. He respected the grandees' traditional privileges, but was careful not to give them too much power. Instead, he relied more on the lesser nobility for administrative tasks. This let him maintain control while avoiding direct conflict with the most powerful families in Spain.
Smart strategy. What about his inner circle, his privy council? Who were the men he trusted to advise him?
Unsurprisingly, his privy council was dominated by Burgundians and Spaniards, a reflection of the power dynamics within his vast domains. One figure that stands out is Francisco de los Cobos, a Spaniard who became Charles V's chief financial advisor. Imagine having to manage the finances of an empire that literally spanned continents.
That's a lot of ledgers. Francisco de los Cobos, the power behind the throne. But what about Charles V's personal leadership style? Was he impulsive, decisive, cautious? How did he approach the massive task of governing his empire?
Based on the lecture, Charles V comes across as a complex, often contradictory figure. He's described as someone who really deliberated before making decisions, weighing all the options and thinking about long-term consequences. But then there are moments where he seems impulsive, driven by a sense of urgency or maybe even a bit of recklessness. He also had a clear tendency towards centralizing power, which of course caused friction with those who wanted to hold on to their regional autonomy. It's this tension between careful planning and the need for decisive action, between centralized authority and regional interest, that really defines a lot of Charles V's reign.
Governing an empire sounds like playing a never-ending game of chess, constantly trying to anticipate everyone else's moves. Speaking of which, wasn't Charles V under constant pressure to marry and produce an heir?
The pressure for a dynastic marriage was immense. The broken promise of marrying Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, hung over him. Plus, there was this growing pressure to marry Isabella of Portugal. You could almost hear the whispers in the court, the speculation about who he'd choose and how it would tip the balance of power.
Royal matchmaking was always a high-stakes game. And on top of all that external pressure, there were internal challenges too, right?
Definitely. The lecture mentions the Morisco Revolt in Valencia. This was a rebellion by descendants of Muslims who had been forced to convert to Christianity. It really highlights the challenges Charles V faced, governing this diverse and often restless population. Imagine trying to keep everything together with so many different groups competing for power and recognition.
Sounds chaotic. So marriage pressures, internal revolts, and the conflict with France simmering in the background. What comes next in this saga?
Well, the story takes us to the papacy of Adrian VI, a man who, unlike his predecessor, was deeply committed to peace. He wanted to dismantle the anti-French alliance that Charles V had built with Pope Leo Capes, hoping to usher in a period of peace across Christendom. But, in this world of shifting alliances and simmering rivalries, peace is always a fragile thing.
A pacifist pope in a world consumed by conflict. I can only imagine the dynamic there.
It was a clash of ideals, really. Adrian VI, yearning for peace, ran up against Charles V's strategic realities. Charles argued that appeasing France would be seen as weakness. It would embolden the Ottomans and put Christendom in danger.
A classic debate. Pursue peace or maintain a strong military presence.
Exactly. And things get even more complicated because there was intrigue brewing within the Vatican itself.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, Cardinal Soderini, who led a faction opposed to Charles V's growing power, actually conspired with France. He even tried to stir up rebellions in Sicily. He was afraid Charles V was becoming too dominant, that his vision of a unified Christendom under imperial rule would threaten the Church's autonomy.
It's like something out of Game of Thrones, betrayal and intrigue in the highest levels of power.
So did Pope Adrian VI's vision for peace win out?
He achieved a temporary victory. Adrian VI proclaimed a 3-year truce across Christendom, and Charles V, maybe recognizing the need for a breather, accepted. This restored their friendship, at least for a time. But beneath the surface, the tensions were still there, just waiting for the right moment to erupt again. The calm before the storm.
And Charles V's trusted advisor, Mercurino Gattinara, saw this truce as a chance to refine their strategy, especially in Italy. He urged Charles V to learn from the mistakes of his grandfather, Maximilian III. He'd been nicknamed the Bad Gardener for his failure to cultivate and hold on to his Italian possessions. Gattinara knew that Italy, with its wealth, strategic location, and cultural influence, was a key player in the European game.
Gattinara sounds like he was always thinking ahead. What other advice did he offer?
He stressed the importance of smart financial management, urging Charles V to strengthen ties with the Castilian Cortes, the representative assembly of Castile. Basically, he was saying, secure your home base, build a strong foundation before going off to conquer the world.
Words to live by. Did Charles V take his advice?
It seems he did. The lecture describes Charles V addressing the Cortes of Valladolid. He cleverly frames France as supporting both Luther and the Ottomans, portraying himself as the defender of both Christendom and the Spanish realms. Masterful propaganda, really, designed to rally support and demonize his enemies.
A master manipulator of public opinion. And how did the Castilian nobility react to this vision of Spain as a bulwark against heresy and foreign enemies?
They were swept up in the excitement. The prospect of global influence and riches had them hooked. Charles V, with his charisma and clever speeches, knew how to tap into those ambitions and use them to his advantage.
He knew how to play the game. What about Francis I? Was he just sitting back and watching Charles V consolidate his power?
No way. The lecture paints Francis I as a hot-headed and ambitious ruler, quick to anger and always eager to assert French dominance. He threatened the Pope, broke the truce, and demanded Milan again, determined to reassert French control over Italy.
So the truce is over and the Game of Thrones is back on.
It was bound to happen. Even Pope Adrian VI, who was initially hesitant to confront France, ended up siding with Charles V after Francis cut off financial support to the papacy. It shows that even in religious affairs, money often talks.
Money makes the world go round. So who else joined Charles V in this renewed fight against France?
It was quite the alliance. The Holy Roman Empire, England, Venice, Florence, Genoa, Lucca, and Siena. It's impressive that Charles V was able to bring together such a diverse and often disagreeing group of allies.
A united front against a common enemy. But this whole web of alliances and rivalries gets even more tangled because of a dramatic defection from the French side.
Now things get really interesting. Charles, the Duke of Bourbon, he was the Constable of France, had a falling out with Francis I over inheritance. He saw an opportunity to grab the French crown for himself with the support of Charles V. A high-risk gamble, a move that could either make him king or lead to his downfall.
That's a bold move. Did he succeed?
Not exactly. His plan was discovered and he had to flee France. He ended up becoming a commander in the imperial army. It shows that even the best-laid plans can go wrong, and the pursuit of power can take some unexpected turns.
From Constable of France to imperial commander. What a change of fortune. And what about the Pope? Was he still firmly against France?
The new pope, Clement VII, also known as Giulio de' Medici, was more cautious and pragmatic than his predecessor. At first, he opposed France, but then, sensing a shift in the balance of power, he started leaning towards peace and neutrality. He didn't want Charles V to become too powerful and knew it was important to maintain a balance of power in Europe.
Always thinking about the long game, it seems like nobody wanted to see one ruler completely dominate the continent.
Exactly. And that brings us to the Battle of Pavia. This is a crucial moment in Charles V's reign, a clash that would reshape the map of Europe.
A clash of titans.
Yeah.
What led to this epic confrontation?
Francis I, never one to back down, retook Milan. He was emboldened by the Pope's shift toward neutrality. This move, along with increasing financial problems and diplomatic pressure, put Charles V in a difficult spot. He was facing a determined enemy, backed by the resources of France and the unspoken support of the papacy.
Not exactly ideal circumstances for a big battle.
No, but sometimes fate has other plans. The Battle of Pavia, fought in February of 1525, was a stunning victory for Charles V. The imperial forces, led by the Duke of Bourbon, who was seeking revenge against his former king, clashed with the French army in this brutal, bloody encounter. The result shocked everyone. Francis III, the proud King of France, was captured right on the battlefield.
I can only imagine the shockwaves across Europe. Capturing the king himself. What an incredible turn of events. How did Charles V react to this victory?
It was unexpected. Instead of bragging or celebrating his triumph, he emphasized his piety and religious devotion. It was a clever move, portraying himself as a humble servant of God, not some power-hungry conqueror. But behind that humility, Charles V was already strategizing his next move.
A true master strategist, even in victory. I'm sure his advisor, Gattinara, had some ideas about how to capitalize on this turn of events.
Gattinara, always prepared, had a plan ready. He advised Charles V to use this newfound leverage to get as much as he could from France, demand Burgundy, pit England against France, and manipulate the Italian states and the papacy to solidify the empire's position. He was like a chess grandmaster, seeing moves ahead and planning accordingly.
Gattinara, the mastermind. It sounds like he was the real brains behind Charles V's success. What else did he suggest?
He also told Charles V to secure a big dowry from Isabella of Portugal to strengthen their alliance and fill the imperial coffers. And to boost his prestige even more, he suggested a grand tour of Italy, ending with a papal coronation in Rome. A vision of imperial grandeur, a show of power that would solidify Charles V's place as the dominant force in Europe.
Brilliant plan. But did Charles V, who was known for being cautious, embrace this bold vision?
Interestingly, the lecture highlights a contrast between Gattinara's grand schemes and Charles V's more cautious personality. He wasn't one to rush into things and often took his time before making a decision. This tension between Gattinara's strategic brilliance and Charles V's deliberative style would shape their relationship and the direction of the empire.
A clash of personalities at the very top. The bold strategist versus the cautious emperor.
Yeah, something like that. And this difference in approach played out in the negotiations with France. Francis V, even as a captive, remained defiant. He refused to give up Burgundy or accept the humiliating terms Charles V was dictating. And across Italy, unease was growing about the possibility of unchecked imperial power.
Understandably, other rulers wouldn't be thrilled about Charles V calling all the shots. What about England? Were they still firmly against France?
The English, led by Cardinal Wolsey, were always looking out for their own interests. Seeing the danger of Charles V becoming too powerful, Wolsey orchestrated a separate peace with France, adding another layer of complexity to the already messy world of European diplomacy.
Alliances changing like the wind. It's hard to keep track of who's on whose side. What about the captive king? How was Francis I doing?
He was held in Spain, first in a bunch of different castles and then in Madrid itself. But despite the restrictions and the pressure to give in, he remained defiant, refusing to sign any treaty that he saw as an insult to his honor and a threat to France.
A proud king, even in chains. But didn't something happen that softened Charles V's stance toward his captive?
Yeah, there was a twist. Francis I got seriously ill, and Charles V, maybe out of compassion or maybe just being practical, finally visited him. A moment of unexpected humanity in this relentless power struggle.
It shows the complexity of Charles V's character, and then his sister arrived, right?
Exactly. Marguerite, Francis I's sister, came to Madrid to beg for her brother's release. She was a skilled negotiator, and her presence brought a whole new dimension to the already complicated diplomacy. But despite her best efforts, the talks were stuck. Francis I wasn't willing to accept Charles V's demands and saw no honorable way out of his situation.
A stalemate. So how did this impasse finally break?
While Francis I, faced with potentially staying captive forever and knowing he had to get back to France to deal with the problems there, finally agreed to sign the Treaty of Madrid. This document would have huge consequences for Europe.
A treaty signed under pressure. What were the main points?
It forced Francis I to give up his claims on Burgundy, offer his two young sons as hostages, and renounce any ambitions he had in Italy. A humiliating defeat for France and a big win for Charles V. But there's a twist to the story.
There's always a twist. What happened?
Before signing, Francis I secretly declared that the treaty was invalid. He claimed he'd been forced into it and therefore wasn't bound by its terms. It was a desperate act of defiance, a gamble that could either save him or make the conflict with Charles V even worse.
So, a treaty signed but not really agreed upon sounds like a recipe for future trouble. How did Charles V react to this deception?
As Francis I was leaving for France, Charles V, maybe sensing the lingering resentment and the potential for more conflict, said goodbye to him, addressing him as brother, a gesture of reconciliation, a nod to the chivalric code that still governed how monarchs interacted. But deep down, the rivalry between these two powerful rulers was far from over. You got to wonder if after all that maneuvering, political and military, Charles V ever had a moment to, just breathe, enjoy his victories.
I imagine running an empire doesn't leave a lot of room for, downtime, but surely there were moments of, personal joy amid all the chaos.
You're right. In the spring of 1526, Charles V marries Isabella of Portugal. And this wasn't just another strategic marriage, it was said to be a love match. He genuinely loved and respected her.
A love story amidst all the empire building, that's quite a contrast. The lecture also mentions Cardinal Salviati officiating the wedding. He was the nephew of Pope Leo X.
Right, a reminder of the Medici family's influence and how connected everyone was in European politics. After the marriage, the imperial couple settled in Granada, where Charles was building that magnificent new palace.
So a brief respite from war and diplomacy to focus on family and maybe enjoy some of the finer things in life.
The calm didn't last, though. Remember that secret declaration Francis I made about the Treaty of Madrid?
Ah, yes, the treaty signed but not really agreed upon. What happened? Did Francis actually go through with disavowing it?
He did. Pretty much as soon as he got back to France, he denounced the treaty publicly, claimed he'd been coerced, so it wasn't valid, and then he went a step further and formed the League of Cognac with the papacy, Venice, and Florence.
So much for the Brotherhood of Kings. Charles V must have been furious.
Gattinara, never one to trust the French, immediately moved to secure Spanish support for another conflict, even though it meant going against the Pope. He was a pragmatist. He knew sometimes you got to make tough choices to protect your interests.
And what about Charles V? How did he react to this betrayal? Did he keep up appearances or did he let his anger show?
This time, his anger definitely came out. The lecture describes a rare instance where Charles V publicly condemned Francis I, called him out for breaking his word and dishonoring treaties. You can sense the personal betrayal, the frustration of a man who thought he'd achieved peace, only to have it shattered.
It makes you wonder, was that a calculated display of anger, to rally support, or was it genuine emotion?
Interesting question. Regardless of the reason, Charles V found himself back at war. He had to make some tough decisions, like pardoning German princes who had supported Luther in exchange for their military support against France.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Real politic in action. But there's trouble on another front too, right?
Yes. The Ottomans, led by Suleiman the Magnificent, had won a major victory at Mohacs in 1526. They defeated the Hungarian army and expanded their influence right into the heart of Europe. This led to Charles V's brother, Ferdinand, being elected King of Bohemia, expanding Habsburg territory, but also bringing them into direct conflict with the Ottomans.
Another enemy to deal with. It seems like Charles V's reign was just one crisis after another. What about the Pope? Was he still siding with France?
Charles V put pressure on Pope Clement VII to leave the League of Cognac and call a council to address the religious divisions in Christendom. He was hoping to isolate France and assert his authority as the defender of the faith. But the Pope, always cautious, didn't want to get caught up in Charles V's schemes. He knew it was important to maintain some independence from the emperor.
Always walking that tightrope. What finally tipped the scales in Charles V's favor?
Well, the lecture suggests that he might have indirectly benefited from a pretty shocking event. The sack of Rome in 1527. Unpaid German mercenaries, fueled by anti-paper sentiment, went on a rampage through the city, causing incredible destruction and chaos.
The sack of Rome, a dark moment in the history of the Renaissance. What were the after effects of that event?
It was a devastating blow to the papacy, both in terms of prestige and actual power. Some historians see it as a turning point, marking the end of the High Renaissance and the start of an era of religious and political turmoil.
It's a strange twist of fate that something so destructive to the church might have actually helped Charles V. But amidst all this chaos and conflict, there was also a glimmer of hope, wasn't there?
You're talking about the birth of Philip, Charles V's heir, in 1527. His arrival, in the middle of all that turmoil, must have felt like a beacon of hope, a promise that the dynasty would continue.
A ray of light in a world filled with war. What about the Pope? Did he ever forgive Charles V for the sack of Rome? Or was their relationship beyond repair?
They did eventually reconcile. They signed the Treaty of Barcelona in 1529. Charles V, skillfully distancing himself from the actions of those mercenaries, agreed to restore territories to the Papal States and support the Medici in Florence.
A practical solution, giving up some territory to secure a powerful ally. But wasn't he also facing a new alliance between his old rivals, France and England?
He was. In 1528, Henry VIII, wanting to get his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, she was Charles V's aunt, by the way, decided to ally with France and declare war on the emperor.
It's like Charles V's enemies were a hydra, cut off one head and two more grow back. How did he respond to this new threat?
In a move that seems almost theatrical, he challenged Francis I to a duel, appealing to the chivalric code and presenting himself as a defender of honor.
A duel between the two most powerful rulers in Europe? That would have been something to see.
It was a gesture, of course, a way to capture the public's attention and frame the conflict in moral terms. But the real war would be fought on battlefields, not in a staged duel. And in Italy, the conflict was already raging.
Let's go back to the Italian front then. What was happening there?
Well, the deaths of some key commanders had created a power vacuum in northern Italy. The Spanish general, Antonio de Leyva, was left in charge of the imperial forces. He was a skilled and experienced soldier, but he was up against a tough opponent in the French commander, Odet de Foix.
And the French, despite their setbacks, were still determined to take Naples, weren't they?
Absolutely. The French siege of Naples was brutal. There was a major French naval victory at Capo d'Orso, which resulted in the deaths of some important Spanish commanders. It looked like the tide was turning in France's favor. But then there was an unexpected twist.
There's always a twist. What happened this time?
The Genoese, led by the Admiral Filippino Doria, switched sides. This deprived the French of their naval support. And as if that wasn't enough, disease swept through the French army, weakening their forces and their morale.
From almost winning to near disaster. It sounds like luck, or maybe divine intervention, played a role in this conflict.
You could say that. The imperial victory at Naples was a turning point. The French had to abandon the siege and shift their focus back to Lombardy, where they were gathering a new army.
Back and forth they go. What about Charles V? Was he content to let his generals fight his battles for him, or was he eager to join the fight?
Well, even though the Spanish were worried about taking resources away from the Iberian Peninsula, Charles V decided to personally lead an army to Italy. A bold move, with a lot of different motivations behind it.
What was he hoping to achieve? Was it just about military glory, or were there deeper strategic goals?
The lecture suggests a few things. He wanted a decisive victory to solidify his control over Italy, and maybe most importantly, to gain papal recognition through a formal coronation in Rome.
The ultimate symbol of power and legitimacy.
Exactly. He entrusted Spain to Isabella, made careful preparations, and set sail for Italy in 1529.
A dramatic departure, full of possibilities. What was waiting for him in Italy?
It seems things moved faster than even Charles V expected. By the time he got there, the military situation had changed completely. Antonio de Leyva had won a big victory, capturing the French commander, Saint-Pol. Francis I was willing to negotiate again.
The emperor arrives just as the war is winding down. What a strange turn of events.
It does show how unpredictable war and diplomacy can be. But his presence was still crucial in shaping the peace. The first step was reconciling with the Pope. They met in Bologna, and after weeks of tough negotiations, they reached an agreement that would have huge implications for the Church and the Empire.
Back to Bologna, the city of towers and secrets. What were the terms of this peace treaty?
The Treaty of Barcelona, signed in 1529, was a masterpiece of diplomacy. Charles V, knowing he needed to appease the Pope, agreed to drop his plans for a church council, a big concession. He also promised to fight against the spread of Lutheranism, solidifying his role as defender of the faith. And to really seal the deal, he agreed to give back territories to the Papal States and support the Medici in Florence.
A series of smart moves to mend fences and secure a powerful ally. But what about the French? Were they finally ready to give up and accept Charles V's dominance?
The Peace of Cambrai, sometimes called the Peace of the Two Ladies, because of the crucial role played by Marguerite of Austria and Louise of Savoy, the mothers of Charles V and Francis I, put an end to that phase of the Franco-imperial conflict. It's a great example of women in diplomacy, mothers working to reconcile their warring sons.
A touching image in the midst of all that conflict.
The peace terms were complicated, reflecting the delicate balance of power in Europe. France had to give up its claims in Italy, but got to keep Burgundy. And to make the peace even stronger, Francis I agreed to marry Charles V's sister, Eleanor of Austria.
Another strategic marriage to try and unite former enemies. What about Francis I's sons? Weren't they still hostages in Spain?
They were, yes. Those young princes, symbols of their father's defeat, were finally released after a large ransom was paid. Imagine the joy of their reunion, the relief of being free from captivity.
A happy ending, at least for the princes. So a fragile peace was achieved. But Charles V still had one major goal he hadn't accomplished yet, didn't he?
You're talking about the imperial coronation.
Exactly. The symbolic peak of his power, the moment that would cement his place as the undisputed ruler of the Holy Roman Empire.
Having secured peace with France and the papacy, Charles V set his sights on Bologna, where the coronation would take place.
A moment centuries in the making.
The lecture describes this grand procession through the streets of Bologna, Charles V surrounded by all the most powerful figures in Europe. Cardinals, dukes, princes, ambassadors, all there to witness this historic event.
It must have been quite a spectacle, all those rivalries and ambitions temporarily set aside for this display of imperial power.
And then, in the magnificent San Petronio Basilica, Charles V knelt before Pope Clement VII and received the Iron Crown of Lombardy, the symbol of his authority over Italy. And then the imperial crown, the ultimate symbol of his dominion over the Holy Roman Empire. A moment that must fill him with a sense of awe and accomplishment, a testament to all his years of struggle and sacrifice.
A true crowning achievement, literally and figuratively. But even as he enjoyed this moment of glory, Charles V's work was far from over. He still had unfinished business to take care of in Florence.
Yes, unfortunately. To please the Pope and get his continued support, Charles V was obligated to crush the Florentine Republic, which had defied Medici rule. The siege of Florence was brutal, with heavy losses on both sides. Even Michelangelo, the famous artist, was involved in defending the city, designing and overseeing the construction of fortifications.
Another reminder that even artistic genius can be put to use in war.
It was a costly victory, showing the Florentines' determination and the lengths to which Charles V would go to secure his alliances. Sadly, the siege also claimed the life of Philippe de Chalon, Prince of Orange, one of the main imperial commanders.
Victory always comes at a price. What happened after the fall of Florence? Did Charles V finally get to enjoy some peace and quiet?
Not really. He left Italy, traveling north through Mantua and Innsbruck. And that's where he got some devastating news. Mercuriano Gattinara, his trusted advisor, the architect of his many successes, had died.
Losing such a close confidant must have been a huge blow.
Gattinara's death marked the end of an era. To honor his service, Charles V abolished the position of imperial chancellor. But the empire needed new leadership, new minds to guide it through the challenges ahead.
So who filled the void left by Gattinara? Who became the new strategist?
Another Burgundian, Nicolas Perrenot, Sieur de Granvelle, rose to prominence. He became a key advisor to Charles V, a skilled diplomat and administrator, able to handle the complexities of imperial politics.
And what about the empire's finances? Who managed those?
Francisco de los Cobos, the Spaniard who'd steadily risen through the ranks, became secretary of the Grand Council. He was put in charge of the empire's vast and complicated finances. He was a shrewd operator and amassed a considerable fortune by skillfully managing the imperial treasury.
So new advisors, new challenges. What awaited Charles V in Innsbruck?
He met with his brother, Ferdinand, his sister, Mary of Hungary, and his brother-in-law, Christian of Denmark, who had recently been deposed. Christian, wanting to get his throne back, pledged allegiance to Catholicism and offered Charles V military support in exchange for help in reclaiming his lost kingdom.
Always making deals, building alliances, and securing support. But Christian's offer came with strings attached, didn't it?
You got it. He expected Charles V to back him against the Protestants in Denmark, which was tricky considering the religious tensions in Germany. The Reformation was still in full swing, and Charles V was already struggling to keep his empire together.
Another dilemma to add to the list. What was the situation in Germany at this point? Had the religious tensions calmed down at all?
Germany was like a powder keg ready to explode. Ferdinand, who was in charge of governing there, had been trying to prevent the establishment of a Lutheran church, but it backfired. This led to the Protestatio at the Diet of Speyer in 1529.
The Protestatio. That was a major turning point in the Reformation, wasn't it?
It was. It was a formal declaration of resistance against the Catholic Church. Several German princes and cities signed it. It marked the emergence of a distinct Protestant identity and showed how firm both sides were in their positions.
The stakes were getting higher. How did Charles V respond to this growing challenge to his authority and the unity of his empire?
He was stuck in a tough spot. He was a devout Catholic, so he felt obligated to defend the church and fight heresy. But as emperor, he also understood the need for unity, especially with the Ottoman threat growing stronger.
A classic dilemma. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Which path did he choose?
He tried to find a middle ground. At first, he favored dialogue and mediation. The Protestants presented their arguments in the Augsburg Confession. This was a key document that outlined their beliefs and tried to find a compromise with the Catholic Church. Charles V, seeing how dangerous internal conflict was, hoped to find a peaceful solution, a way to reconcile everyone and keep Christendom united.
A noble goal, but did it work? Was he able to bring peace to his troubled empire?
Sadly, the differences were too big, the feelings too strong. Even though Charles V personally got involved in theological discussions and really wanted reconciliation, the talks failed. He faced pressure from Catholic hardliners and the stubbornness of some Protestant leaders, so he gave an ultimatum. He demanded that the Protestants accept the imperial decrees against Lutheranism.
A gamble. Was he really willing to risk a civil war to enforce religious unity?
It was a tough call, full of risk. He knew that a full-blown conflict with the Protestants could bring France and England into the fray, making things even more unstable and jeopardizing all his achievements.
So, stuck between a rock and a hard place. A devout Catholic emperor facing a Protestant rebellion. What happened next?
The Protestants, sensing the threat to their newfound freedom, formed the Schmalkaldic League, a military alliance to protect themselves and resist the emperor. The empire was on the verge of civil war.
It's a good thing he had secured his brother's succession then. At least the Habsburg dynasty would continue even if the empire fell apart.
That's true. Ferdinand being elected king of the Romans guaranteed the Habsburgs would keep ruling, but it came with a cost. To get the electors' support, Ferdinand had to give concessions to the Protestants, which weakened Charles V's authority and encouraged his opponents.
Another strategic retreat, another compromise in the face of difficult circumstances. Where did Charles V go after this test standoff with the Protestants?
He went back to the Netherlands, his Burgundian inheritance. This was after his aunt and regent, Margaret of Austria, had died. It was a homecoming of sorts, a time to consolidate his power in the north and deal with the problems facing his ancestral lands.
So, a new chapter begins. A shift from the heart of the empire to its northern edge. What awaited him in the Netherlands?
Yeah, it really is remarkable how these different forces were starting to come together. The Ottomans, the French, and all the shifting alliances in Europe. It's a lot.
It really is. So how did Charles V react to this Franco-Ottoman alliance? Was he worried, or did he just see it as another obstacle to overcome?
He saw it as a major threat, a challenge to his authority, and potentially a turning point in the fight for control of Europe. He didn't want to wait for them to make the first move. He decided to take the initiative and launched a pretty bold campaign in North Africa.
North Africa, that's a surprising move. Why the sudden shift in strategy?
A few reasons, actually. First, he wanted to strike at the core of this Franco-Ottoman alliance, disrupt their plans, and weaken their combined strength. Second, he saw a chance to secure his hold on Italy and eliminate the French threat once and for all. And then there's this feeling that Charles V, maybe inspired by what his ancestors had done, was looking for personal glory, a chance to prove himself a warrior king like Charlemagne or Richard the Lionheart.
A mix of strategy and personal ambition. But wasn't this a big risk? North Africa was far from the center of his empire, and the Ottomans were not easy to defeat.
It was definitely risky, and not everyone in his court agreed with it. Even Juan de Tavera, the Archbishop of Toledo and one of his trusted advisors, advised against this overseas venture. But Charles V felt a sense of urgency, a belief in his destiny, and he was determined to go ahead with it.
A leader willing to go against the grain and take chances? What exactly was he hoping to accomplish in North Africa?
His main target was the city of Tunis. It had recently fallen under the control of Harad Barbarossa, an Ottoman admiral and notorious pirate who was a real problem for Christian powers. Barbarossa had built up a strong fleet, was raiding coastal towns, disrupting trade, and his alliance with France was a direct threat to Spain's interests in the Mediterranean.
So Charles V saw this as an opportunity to take out both the Ottomans and the French, eliminating a common enemy and securing his southern borders. How did he put together an army for this campaign?
He called upon the resources of his vast empire, gathering troops from Spain, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. He also got the support of the Knights of Malta, a powerful military order dedicated to defending Christendom against the infidels. And to make sure he had control of the seas, he secured the services of the Genoese admiral, Andrea Doria, a skilled tactician with lots of experience in Mediterranean warfare.
A truly multinational force, a real testament to the power and reach of Charles V's empire. How did the campaign go? Did the imperial forces win a decisive victory?
The campaign started in 1535 with a quick and decisive victory at La Goleta, a crucial fortress guarding the harbor of Tunis. Charles V himself led the imperial forces. They stormed the fortress, overcame fierce resistance, and secured a critical foothold in North Africa.
A strong start. What happened next?
Encouraged by their initial success, the imperial forces then confronted Barbarossa's fleet in a major naval battle. They crushed the Ottoman fleet and gained control of the seas. That victory, along with the capture of La Goleta, sealed the fate of Tunis. The city fell to the imperial forces, and Barbarossa had to flee.
Another impressive victory for Charles V. How did he use this to his advantage?
He returned to Europe like a conquering hero, with huge celebrations in Sicily and Naples. People hailed him as a liberator and a hero. It was during this victory tour that the phrase, "an empire on which the sun never sets," was first used to describe his vast and growing domains. It was a time of great power and prestige for Charles V, a testament to his military skills, his diplomatic talent, and his sheer determination.
It's amazing to think about everything he accomplished, the size of his empire, and the challenges he faced. But even at the height of his power, Charles V couldn't escape the passage of time, could he?
True. The lecture mentions this touching moment where Charles V, at 36, finds his first gray hairs. It reminds us that even emperors, the most powerful people in the world, are subject to the same laws of nature, the same passing of time as everyone else.
A humbling thought. But his work wasn't finished, was it? He still had things to deal with in Europe, like settling scores with France and navigating his complex relationship with the papacy.
Exactly. In 1536, he made his first visit to Rome, where he received a grand welcome from Pope Paul III. But underneath all the pomp and circumstance, there were simmering tensions, unresolved issues that could disrupt the peace.
What were the main points of friction between Charles V and the Pope?
Well, Charles V was pushing for a church council. He wanted to settle the religious disputes that were dividing Christendom and reassert his authority as the defender of the faith. He also wanted to force Francis I to participate, believing that a united front against the Protestants was crucial to protect the Catholic Church.
But the Pope, even though he was allied with Charles V, had his own agenda, right?
Of course. Paul III was a smart and ambitious pope. He was wary of Charles V trying to control the church. He was open to a council, but he wanted to set the terms and make sure the pope's authority wasn't weakened.
Another clash of personalities, another power struggle at the heart of Christendom. What happened next? Did this conflict get worse, or did they find some common ground?
As they were dealing with this, news came from Italy that Francesco Sforza, the Duke of Milan, had died without an heir. This suddenly revived French claims to the duchy and threatened to drag Italy back into war, reigniting the conflict between Charles V and Francis I.
So another crisis emerges, another threat to the fragile peace. How did Charles V handle this?
He acted quickly and decisively. He gave a powerful speech in Rome, condemning French ambitions and skillfully securing the Pope's neutrality. Then he focused on military matters, determined to stop the French from taking control of Milan.
Always the strategist. But there were disagreements among his own advisors, weren't there? Not everyone agreed with how he was approaching this.
True. Some of his advisors, like Antonio de Leyva, who was the experienced commander of the imperial forces in Italy, thought it would be better to focus on retaking Savoy, which the French had captured. But Charles V, maybe wanting a more decisive victory, decided to attack France directly. He launched a campaign aimed at the heart of his enemy's territory.
Bold move. But was it the right one? Direct attacks can backfire sometimes.
In this case, it turned out to be a mistake. The French, knowing the attack was coming, used scorched earth tactics, destroying the countryside and preventing the imperial army from getting the supplies and resources they needed. After weeks of difficult marches and small battles, Charles V was forced to retreat. His army was exhausted and their morale was low.
A humiliating defeat for Charles V. A reminder that even the most powerful rulers can overreach.
It was a turning point for him. Tired of war and realizing the limits of his power, he started looking for a lasting peace with France.
Did he find it? Was he able to end the seemingly endless conflict with his rival?
He made good progress. Pope Paul III, wanting peace and unity within Christendom, stepped in and arranged a meeting in Nice between Charles V and Francis I.
A meeting between two of the most powerful men in the world. What came out of it?
It was tense and full of mistrust at first. They were still resentful and suspicious of each other. They refused to meet face to face and negotiated separately with the Pope instead. But after weeks of diplomacy, they finally reached an agreement and signed the 10-year Truce of Nice in 1538.
A temporary truce, a break in the fighting, but not lasting peace.
Exactly. The truce kept things as they were, but didn't solve any of the underlying problems. But there was one positive development. Charles V and Francis I finally agreed to meet face to face, first on Charles V's ship and then at Aigues-Mortes, a town on the French coast.
A face-to-face meeting after all those years of conflict. What was the significance of that?
It was a symbolic gesture, maybe a sign that the two rivals, older and wearier now, were ready to put their differences aside and find a way to coexist peacefully. But as Charles V sailed away from that meeting, he must have realized that real peace was still a long way off. The forces of ambition, rivalry, and religious zeal that had shaped his reign were still there, threatening to undo everything he had achieved.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the reign of Charles V. We've seen him grow from a young, inexperienced ruler into a seasoned emperor. He navigated a world of shifting alliances, religious turmoil, and constant warfare. What are some of the key takeaways from his remarkable journey?
I think one thing we can learn is the importance of adapting. Charles V had to constantly adapt to changing situations, adjust his strategies, and change his goals based on what was happening. He learned to balance ambition with practicality, realizing that compromise is sometimes necessary to achieve lasting success.
And we've also seen how personal experiences can have a big impact on a ruler's perspective and their decisions.
Definitely. Charles V's time in Spain, being exposed to different cultures and political systems, his strong religious beliefs, and his complicated relationships with his advisors all shaped how he saw the world and the choices he made.
Another thing that stands out is the tension between his medieval worldview, which emphasized a unified Christendom under imperial rule, and the rising forces of nationalism and religious dissent. These forces challenged the established order and changed the political landscape of Europe.
That's a crucial point. Yeah. Charles V was caught between two worlds. He was trying to balance his ideal of a unified Christendom with the reality of a world that was becoming more fragmented and diverse.
It makes you wonder what would have happened if he had lived longer, if he had had more time to solidify his power and make his vision a reality. Could he have overcome those challenges and created a truly unified and lasting empire? Or was he always going to be a transitional figure, a bridge between the medieval world and the modern age, a ruler who ultimately couldn't achieve his grand ambitions?
Those are questions historians are still debating. But one thing is certain. Charles V's reign was a pivotal moment in European history, a time of significant change and upheaval that set the stage for centuries of conflict and transformation.
This has been a fascinating look into the reign of Charles V, a ruler who left a lasting impact on the world. We've explored his successes and failures, his goals, and the challenges he faced, and we've gained a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped his life and legacy. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery.